Uh, what I will be presenting today are sort of the first steps of a work in progress on Charisse pataphysics and notions of temporality, on which I'll be focusing. And I would like to start my discussion today with a short quotation taken from Charisse's L'amour invisible from 1898. In this text we find a dialogue between two allegorical persons, fear and love, and fear opens up the conversation with a question. Your clock has 3 hands. Why is that? And love answers, nothing could be more natural, nothing simpler. Calm down. The first marks the hour, the second urges on the minutes, and the third, forever motionless, eternalizes my indifference. Now what are we to make of this utterance? Firstly, we might respond by emphasizing the role of love and simply discerning in this utterance, say, romantic ideas stressing love's indifference to time. Secondly, we might take this as a sign of the general indifference toward time in Charisse's writings and ask ourselves whether a paper on pataphysics may not be somewhat misplaced at a conference dealing with time and temporality and modernism and the avant-garde. Thirdly, we can look at this utterance as demonstrating a profound skepticism towards measured time and the modes of rationalization and organization that characterize the process of modernization. In this sense, the utterance can be seen to contain a kind of subversive energy in its resistance toward linear temporality. The reference to the clock in this work belongs to a whole web of reflections on the nature of time in Charisse's writings. As Alastair Brocci points out in his recent biography of the author, conceptions of time are central to Charisse's works, sometimes explicitly, but at other times hidden. I would like to present some reflections on this idea of temporality in Charisse's writings. Taking as a point of departure the neo-scientific novel, as it was called in the subtitle, Geste d'opinion du Docteur Faustrol, pataphysicien, written in 1898, published in 1911. Here we have a cover illustration. This is not the original publication, but much nicer than the original one, because we have this very nice picture. My focus in my paper will be on the role of esotericism and particularly alchemy in Charisse's fictional universe. Let me stress here at the outset that when I'm dealing with esotericism, I do not approach the subject exclusively in terms of a religious system of thought that is rooted in the past and gains importance as a counter-model of epistemologies of modernity. I rather understand esotericism, following Andreas Bekilcher, as a complex epistemological phenomenon and a fluid product of discourses and interpretations that make its appearance in various discourses of European modernity, be it in the fields of religious thought, science, philosophy, literature, or elsewhere. This discursive approach gives us a useful tool to describe the links between scientific discourse, literary fantasy, and religious patterns in Charisse's pataphysics, which aims at the construction of a new, profoundly aesthetic worldview. When focusing on the role of alchemy in this worldview, we should remain aware that Charisse's work presents a confusing mixture of discourses with multiple layers of symbology, as Andrew Hugel puts it, and to privilege alchemy in this mixture may be to give it too much importance. Rather than approaching pataphysics in terms of an alchemical project, we need to explore the specific role of alchemy in this confusing mixture of Charisse's aesthetic rhetoric. Before going further, it is probably useful to shortly address the question, what is pataphysics? The first steps toward pataphysics were taken by Charisse as he started attending Bergson's courses on philosophy in 1891. Bergson's philosophy provided Charisse with the philosophical underpinning for pataphysics, which to some extent explains the central role of time in his writings. Of special importance for Charisse was Bergson's broad approach to philosophy, which, as Brocci describes, traveled down all sorts of forgotten paths and dead ends in the history of ideas, thus opening up a broad spectrum of philosophical and scientific thought to the young author. Especially appealing for Jarry was Bergson's notion of duration and its relation to the freedom of the subject, as expressed among others in Essais sur l'hédonisme immédiat de la conscience, where Bergson writes, "We are rarely free. The greater part of the time we live outside ourselves, hardly perceiving anything of ourselves but our own ghost, a colorless shadow with which pure duration projects into homogeneous space. Hence we live for the external world rather than for ourselves. We speak rather than think. We are acted rather than act ourselves. To act freely is to recover possession of oneself and to get back into pure duration." End of quote. The importance of duration thus lies in the subject's will to break with determinism, gaining control over one's own experience. On another level, this signals for Jarry the possibility of contesting existing scientific models of the world and engaging in the construction of an alternative one, which he came to call pataphysics. Pataphysics have been regarded by different critics and commentators as a cosmic fart, an ultimate spoof, an attitude of mind, a doctrine, or even a deeply ironic religion. In Forstrol, Jarry himself defines pataphysics as the science of imaginary solutions, which symbolically attributes the properties of objects described by their virtuality to the lineaments. He further describes pataphysics as a science of the particular that will examine the laws governing exceptions and will explain the universe supplementary to this one, or less ambitiously will describe a universe which can be and perhaps should be envisaged in place of the traditional one. Finally, Jarry describes pataphysics as the science of that which is superinduced upon metaphysics, extending as far beyond metaphysics as the latter extends beyond physics. These formulations show that pataphysics can to some extent be described as a scientific satire, Wissenschaftssatire, we would say in German, an aesthetic discourse parodying the rhetoric of the natural sciences. When addressing pataphysics in terms of a scientific satire or parody, it is important, however, to stress that we are not dealing with an anti-scientific or even anti-rational discourse, since, as Hugel has stressed, the relationship between the parodistic aspects of pataphysics and the thing it parodies is complex, ironic, or even meta-ironic. In Jarry's formulations, we can firstly hear the echo of a traditional rhetoric of modern esotericism, as he stresses the necessity of superseding existing scientific models and even the tradition of metaphysics by establishing a higher order of thought. Yet this visionary aspect of esoteric discourse also seems strangely hollow, as it dissolves in its own paradoxes by means of the text's profound irony. With the use of aesthetic devices, the scientific and esoteric claims of the text are in a certain sense ridiculized, but at the same time, Jarry's depiction of the elements of pataphysics, as he calls it, sticks rigorously to the genre of a scientific treatise. If the text can in fact be labeled a satire, we are not only dealing with a scientific satire, but also with a satire aimed at the discourse of modern esotericism and the language of literature as such. In other words, if we are dealing with an ironic version of science or pseudoscience, we are simultaneously dealing with the manifestation of a new kind of pseudo-literature. To explore the role of the natural sciences in Forstrol, it is useful to take a closer look at the role of measuring instruments in Jarry's novel. The importance of exact measuring is stressed from the beginning as Forstrol is introduced and the reader is provided with exact information about the protagonist's height. And here I want to use the PowerPoint. I think it's easier for you to see the formulation than for me to read it aloud. As Forstrol then starts his journey with his two fellow travelers on a small boat, or rather sieve, navigating on dry land through the streets and islands of Paris, the narrator explains that he brings with him his compasses, maps, sextants, and various other scientific instruments. These instruments come to play an important role in the final chapters of the novel after Fosterol's death through a boating accident. The seriousness of the incident is described by Fosterol in 2 telepathic letters to the renowned English physicist Lord Kelvin, whose popular lectures and addresses on the constitution of matter had been published in French translation in 1891. Fosterol describes, this is Kelvin, and here is the quote that is now coming in the French original. The body is a more necessary vehicle because it supports one's clothes, and through clothes, one's pockets. I had left in one of my pockets by mistake my centimeter, an authentic copy in brass of the traditional standard, more portable than the Earth or even the terrestrial quadrant. I no longer even had my tuning fork. Imagine the perplexity of a man outside time and space who has lost his watch and his measuring rod and his tuning fork. I believe, sir, that it is indeed this state which constitutes death. The seriousness of the situation should be rather clear to the recipient, Lord Kelvin, who had explained in his lectures, quote, that when you can measure what you are speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. End of quote. Only after a yellow spectrum has returned to Fosterol his centimeter by virtue of this figure here, does he become capable of measuring and identifying the new space in which he finds himself as the ether. He describes the space as Ethernity, thus emerging as a time traveler in the new dimension. Following these events, Fosterol measures the surface of God and comes to the conclusion by strict mathematical calculation that leads him to this formula, that God is the tangential point between 0 and infinity. On the one hand, this excursion into the fictional universe of Fosterol, which I'm afraid has provided those of you not acquainted with Jarry's work with quite a few problems, demonstrates the specific modus of incomprehensibility with which we are confronted in pataphysics, as opposed to other modes of incomprehensibility often referred to as characteristic of literary modernism. On the other hand, it points toward the role of alchemy in Jarry's pataphysics, spiritual alchemy presenting, to quote Karen Claire Voss, a form of illumination, a means of transmutation, a method for experiencing levels of reality that are not ordinarily accessible since they exist beyond the level of everyday reality. Fosterol's travels that lead him into eternity present an allegorical narrative of alchemical initiation, resulting in a realm of higher knowledge, as stressed in the concluding sentence of the novel, pataphysics is the science. Of importance is further the rejection of linear time that is a core element of spiritual alchemy, where time is conceived of in cyclical terms. In alchemy, past, present and future are only apparently separated from each other, the movement of time being understood not so much as movement as a mode of perception that can be overcome by attaining a higher knowledge. Fosterol's entry into eternity can thus be seen not only as an allusion to spiritualist notions of an afterlife in another dimension, which was often related with the idea of the ether around the turn of the century, but also as a logical conclusion of the protagonist's alchemical journey, leading into an alternative temporality. On another level, the idea of the ether can be seen as symptomatic of an important element in Jarry's writing. The ether is one of the central concepts in pataphysics that are extremely hard to locate or contextualize. To give a slight insight into the semantic energy of the ether, it was at this time still a valid term discussed in physics, but it was also a term of importance in esoteric discourse, not least in theosophy. And finally, it was a term that circulated in popular culture, where it was related with fantasies of electronic communications and visions of another dimension, often referred to metaphorically as the etheric ocean, which may shed some light on Fosterol's travels on a ship on dry land in our novel. Finally, Jarry is known to have been an occasional drinker of ether in his later years, as maybe some of us know. Equally obscure and semantically multi-layered are other key terms of pataphysics, such as syzygy, with its references to Gnosticism, as well as medicine, philosophy, mathematics, poetry, psychology, and zoology. The introduction of such concepts into the language of pataphysics plays a key role in Jarry's construction of a new, scientifically founded literary language. Another important aspect of Jarry's textual practices consists in his use of long passages taken from scientific treatises. In Forsterol, we do not only come across references to the theories of scientists like Lord Kelvin, Clerk Maxwell, Sir William Crookes, Arthur Cayley, and C.V. Boyce, but parts of the novel are also directly lifted from their writings. A curious letter quoted in Brocchi's biography, which was found in the archives of the Society of Psychical Research, sheds an interesting light on Jarry's textual practice of plagiarism and simulation of scientific discourse. As the British chemist and physicist William Crookes received a copy of Jarry's commentary and instruction for the practical construction of the time machine, large parts of which were taken from Lord Kelvin's writings, Crookes certainly found two possible fallacies, but he still mistook this text for a genuine scientific treatise. This incident underlines to which respect the specific character of Jarry's late simplest writings is rooted in a process of reproduction and simulation of scientific discourse. Its attempt at a radical renovation of literary language is not the product of an autonomous aesthetic discourse exploring new means of expression. It can rather be described as a process of integrating what we can call the inherent poetics of the scientific and esoteric discourse of modernity into the literary system. To put it shortly, in pataphysics we are, at least to some extent, not dealing with the incomprehensibility of literary modernism, but rather with the incomprehensibility of modern science. As Brocchi puts it, Jarry recognized the literary and imaginative potential of the increasing abstraction of modern science, as it found itself in search of a new language capable of describing new material substances that were being discovered. The radical experimental impetus of Jarry's work thus lies in his act of taking modern science seriously, steeping his literary work in the new discourse, reproducing and simulating its rhetoric rather than appropriating it within the confines of a literary language. This is what gives them a specific status in the context of aesthetic modernity. Jarry's work verging on the boundary between late symbolism and an upcoming avant-garde. Deciphering this literary work is certainly not an easy task for the reader, who is desperately in need of a process of initiation, measuring instruments, if not a truly original brain, as described by Jarry in alchemical terms in 1903. And I would like to end my talk on a quotation from this text. So you have here in the French original. A truly original brain works exactly like the stomach of the ostrich. Everything is good for it. It pulverizes rocks and twists bits of iron. A real personality does not assimilate anything. It deforms better. It transmutes in the ascending direction of the hierarchy of metals. When it is placed in conjunction with the unsurpassable, with the great work, what occurs is not imitation, but transposition. The whole mechanism of the association of ideas is triggered in parallel with associations of ideas in the work which, to use a sporting expression that is here quite appropriate, then serve as a trainer or coach. Thank you.